further ado, Mr. Munk.
Thank you. I thought everybody would be at the beach this afternoon, so I'm amazed to see so many people. The announcement about today's talk had one error. It said I was a retired professor at Scripps. I'm not retired. I flunked retirement. I have the wonderful benefit of a special chair given to me by the Secretary of the Navy about 28 years ago. And so I can keep on working without taking the job away from someone younger. And my story to you is really very much connected with the fact that I've had wonderful relations with the Navy, and the theme of today's afternoon talk about the war years is very much connected with that. Now, if I could have you're ahead of me. The first slide, La Jolla Shores. When I first came here in '39, Mary Coakley is a president of Friends of La Jolla Shores. There was no La Jolla Shores at the time. She didn't have many friends. It was empty. The beach club was there, and there was one house south of the beach club, and there was Scripps Institution, and lovely and empty. And Scripps itself had 15 people when I came in '39, including the gardener, and now we have 1,500. So it has changed by 2 orders of magnitude since I came here. We all lived at Scripps in a bunch of shabby cottages, of which some have been retained. And there was a letter written by the regents at the time, which I remember saying, we need to be informed, we the regents, what does Scripps consist of? And he got the answer back that Scripps consists of a pier and a water tower, both in need of repair. It was a good description of Scripps at the time. And 2 miles of space between the village and Scripps. And we used to, at the time, hopefully affectionately, be known as the Bug House south of town, where people do odd things. The next slide shows Director Harald Sverdrup at the time when I came in '39. He was a Norwegian. He'd been there for 2 years. Roger, by the way, Roger Rebel, who's so much connected to this society here, his wife Ellen had just gotten his PhD when I arrived in '39. And Harald Sverdrup had been in the Arctic for 7 years on Amundsen's expedition, the Maud, M-A-U-D. Wonderful man, and was to have a great influence on my entire life afterwards. And I came in the summer. I wish I could tell you that I came because I was born knowing that I loved the oceans, I wanted to work on the oceans. But it was somewhat different. I was at Caltech, I was a junior. I'd fallen in love with a girl at Scripps College. Her grandparents lived here in La Jolla, and she was going to spend the summer, and I wanted to have enough money so I could date her. And the only job one could possibly get in La Jolla in 1939 was at Scripps, and I drove down one morning and appeared at Harald Sverdrup, said, could I have a summer job? And I got a student summer job for $50 a month. And
Walter, is that you?
that, yes.
Wow!
I don't know whether it's a compliment.
It is.
Well, anyhow, I came down, and Harald Sverdrup offered me a job, and my girlfriend, her grandparents were J.C. Harper, who was a lawyer for the Scripps family, and her parents, named Anderson, may know them, and they lived at the corner of Torrey Pines and Prospect Street. The same house is still there, and some of you might have known the family, Hudnall, was her sister, and we had a wonderful year. We would pick up abalones from the piles of Scripps Pier at low tide, and I had abalones for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I've not been able to eat them since. Anyway, it was a great summer. We got to know Harold Sverdrup, who would tell us about his life in the Arctic. I got absolutely fascinated. And then we had a little tennis court at Scripps, and I would play tennis with his wife, Gudrun. And whenever I lost, they would invite me for dinner for fiske pudding. And we had a wonderful opportunity to hear about the stories. My love affair with this particular girl did end, but I was back next year, next summer, to ask whether Harold Sverdrup would take me on as a student. And I'd been in love with Scripps ever since. And I remember when asking Harold whether he would take me on, he didn't say anything for 10 seconds, which is a good, long, long time. And then he said, well, I cannot think of a single job opening in the next 20 years or 10 years. And I said, oh, I'll take it. And I was very lucky. What happened at the time was that the only jobs in this field were the ones that the university supported at Scripps, Seattle, and Woods Hole. And the next job would open when somebody died. And nobody was going to die very soon. So that was the situation. Then, of course, what happened is that the war started, and the government became the sponsor of oceanographic research, and the field just exploded. And there must have been 20 years following that, or 30 years, when there wasn't a time when I didn't have 2 job offers. And 3 times almost left Scripps. And then when the time really came, and decided that I'd stay happily. Well, next year I was back for a job, it was 1940, and the country where I was born, Austria, had been occupied by the Nazis, and I was very concerned, and I joined the army. Left Scripps after the summer and joined the army, joined the field artillery. And I had by then a master's degree, and what they would normally have done with me at the time is to make me a signal officer, an officer in the Signal Corps. I didn't want to be an officer in the Signal Corps, so I enlisted as a private, and in Seattle. I had a sort of a curious time, because at the time when I joined the army, most of the people in my unit were in because they had been found doing something bad, like stealing. And the judge said, you have your choice, you go to jail or join the army. And so that was some of the people I joined with, but it was a very interesting time. I told Mary that I have an accent from my Austrian youth, and I had a sergeant who took advantage of it by having me pronounce things loudly. We used to practice firing, and somebody had to be on the left side of everybody, and would say, commence firing, oh no, ready on the left, and then the sergeant would say, and Corporal Munk, and I say, ready on the right, and I don't say ready very well. And everybody roared with laughter, and he said, I can't hear you, sing out loud. And his name was Sergeant Rubush, and I told Mary that I swore if I ever met him after the war, I would shoot him. but we had, oh, and you showed the next picture, we had a good time. In the winter, they had the first American ski troops on Mount Rainier, and later that moved to Mount Hood. You might remember that. And I was allowed to join the ski troops. I was an avid skier, and we had a wonderful 3 months on Mount Rainier, practicing skiing with a heavy rucksack, which is something to learn. Now I want to talk a little bit about my background. I was born in Austria, and I have a picture coming up, Mary, showing a house where I grew up near Salzburg. And we were there last year, Mary and I. It's a 17th century farmhouse that my grandfather restored between the forest and the brook, and it's a beautiful area. And we did a lot of skiing, and I was an avid skier. And when I told my mother, I did not come here as a refugee in the usual way. I wanted to become a ski teacher. Some of you might remember that there used to be a revolution in the technique of skiing. It used to be the Norwegian school based on telemark, with your skis close together. And then a man named Hannes Schneider started the Arlberg technique, which is Christianias, which was different. And I knew Hannes Schneider, and I was a great enthusiast, and he helped me learn skiing. And so when I was 15, I told Mother I was going to be a ski teacher. I was a terrible student. I was flunking out of high school. And Mother had some American friends for dinner once, and she complained about her son. And he said, "Oh, I have a son just like Walter. And we found the school for him in Lake George, New York. And it's a school for boys who don't study." And I was exiled to America to go to Silver Bay School. And a year later, we had started a ski club, and I was president. And Mother was greatly disappointed. It hadn't worked very well. And I also was an avid tennis player. I think the next picture shows us playing tennis in Austria by the lake in that little village. The little village has not changed. We were there last year, and it's gone from 300 people to 302. And it's very nice. And I think I have another picture from my youth. My stepfather was director of the salt mines. He's giving a talk here. There's an ancient salt mine. Some of you may have been there in that area. Tourists can go in, and the salt mines are in the mountain, and you let water go in and form lakes under the mountains. It's rock salt, and it dissolves and is sent into town and is evaporated. And it's an ancient profession. They have their own uniforms. They have their own greeting, which is very nice. It's a greeting called Glück auf, luck up, up with your luck. And the group it is 700-800 years old, and actually our house there is on the way from the village to the salt mines, and the miners have had an ancient tradition that they can go through our land to save a little time, and I was accustomed to wake up and hearing people say Glück auf, a nice greeting. It's no longer a state monopoly, by the way. It changed into private ownership about 20 years ago. It used to belong to the bishops of Salzburg, and then became a state monopoly. Well, anyhow, I was exiled to Lake George and went to school, passed actually, and then worked in a bank in New York that my grandfather was a Viennese banker, and they had a branch in New York. And I hated every minute of it. And I did very, very badly, and they were very happy when I said I would leave. And so I bought a car and drove to Pasadena and showed up at Caltech. And I have to tell you why I had chosen Caltech. I didn't know anything about it, but I'd fallen in love with the Spanish street names, San Marino and so I showed up at the Dean's in 37, and he said, "Let me pull your file." And I said, "There isn't any file." I thought you'd just go up here and say, "I'm going to attend classes." And the luckiest thing ever happened in my life is he said, you can get yourself a room and study for a month, and I'll let you take an entrance exam. And by some horrible luck, I got in. And it wasn't so hard at the time. There wasn't really. And I loved Caltech, had a very nice time. And then came down to Scripps to become a graduate student here. Well, I joined the Army and was in for almost 2 years. And the Scripps started a group that worked with the Navy at Point Loma. It's something they called the U.S. Navy Radio and Sound Laboratory. Some of you might have heard of it. It was the earliest research effort in San Diego at the time, U.S. Navy. And the University of California had started something called the Division of War Research, and this was part of it. And Roger Revelle and Harold Sverdrup and Martin Johnson and all had started to try and help in connection with anti-submarine warfare. The Germans were sinking Allied shipping at a terrible rate. Nobody knew how to find the submarines, and this was an effort to learn how one could locate submarines. And Roger had jumped into uniform. He was a lieutenant junior grade in the US Navy, and was helping to get the thing started. And they wrote a letter to the Secretary of the War saying, "You have a corporal who knows something about the oceans, and we're very short. Can he be discharged?" And I got out after about 1.5 years of service. And I got out on the 1st of December, 1941, and 8 days later, Pearl Harbor happened.
Wow.
And I would have never gotten out. All discharges were canceled, and my division was sent to the own Stanley Mountains in Guinea and got wiped out. Anyhow, I started working out of Scripps at Point Loma. We would go down every morning by car, 7 of us, to learn something about ocean acoustics. Mary said I should tell the story. It was a very interesting place at the time. Lake Hodges, you know, you all know Lake Hodges. It had a little army detachment because all reservoirs were under threat in some sense. And I used to date Peggy Scripps, granddaughter of E.W.'s. We used to go dancing at Lake Hodges. There was an old dive there. And the corporal who was in charge of the security stopped me. He heard me talking with my Austrian accent, said, "What are you doing here?" And I didn't like that. And I said, "I'm here to blow up your dam." And next morning when I appeared at the Navy at Point Loma, the commanding officer, the captain, said, "I've had a notice that you were going to threaten to blow up the dam at Lake Hodges. Better not do that again." Well, then comes the story I want to tell, which is not very pretty. Harold Sverdrup, whom I mentioned, was director, wonderful man, tremendously good scientist. And we used to drive every morning down from La Jolla into San Diego to appear at the Point Loma laboratory. And one morning he appeared, and the guard at the opening said, "Dr. Sverdrup, I can't let you in." And thought it was some kind of a foul-up, mistake. Well, it turns out his clearance had been canceled. And we didn't really know the answer for 30 years afterwards. But Harold Sverdrup was Norway was occupied by then by the Germans. His sisters had gone to jail. His brother had been killed on a commando raid with the British commandos. And it meant a lot to him to be able to be part of the war effort. And he was just kept out from one day to the next. And 30, and I should tell you, and my clearance was canceled a month later because I was working with him so closely. And we didn't really know what had happened. It's sort of the black hole of my life. But my wife Judy once insisted, said, you're going to find out what happened. And she wrote to the, what's it called, Freedom of Information Act people. And we got a pile of papers 6 months later, this thick. And it turns out that 3 members of the Scripps Institution had reported that he was a sympathizer with the Nazis, not a good American. And it's one of the terrible things that happened. You asked about wartime. It was a very good time, really, because everybody worked together. I've never been in a time when people had so much pleasure in helping each other, but there were these clearance problems that were just terrible for the people who suffered under it. And so Harold Sverdrup went home to Norway, kind of heartbroken, I think. I lost my clearance, and then a professor at Scripps, who had become a major in the Air Force, Army Air Corps at the time, working in the Pentagon, said, well, you know, the Navy doesn't know what they're doing, but you can come and work with us. And so I went to work in the Pentagon. And while I was there, learned that there was going to be an amphibious landing by the Allies in Northwest Africa. And you have to remember, at that time, the Allies were losing. The Germans were making, the Axis was taking the initiative. The Allies were responding, always too late. And the war was not going well. And this was the first time when the Americans and the British said, we're going to do something first. We're going to land in Northwest Africa. And I went down to South Carolina, where they were practicing landings using landing craft, LCVP, landing craft vehicle personnel. You know, they come to the beach and drop the bow and run ashore. And found that when the wave breakers exceeded 5 feet, the landing craft would broach, turn parallel to shore, water would fall, would come into the boat, people get hurt, and they'd say, well, we secure until tomorrow, until the waves are lower. And this happened generally when waves were breaking above 5 feet. And I went back to the Pentagon and looked at some literature and said, how high are the waves in our landing beaches in Northwest Africa? In the winter, more than 6 feet on the average. I said, well, I can't understand how we're going to come in. We just have to find a way of picking a couple of days of low waves. And so I went to my commanding officer and say, I think we ought to learn how to predict waves so we can pick 2 good days and help people get in. And you know, I was young and without any, no reputation, and he said, all right, Mr. Munk, just don't worry about it. And I'm sure they have thought about it. They must know. And I have learned since there were no they. It really is incredible. And so in my agony, I telephoned Harold Sverdrup, who was still there, said, please come out. He had an international reputation. And we spent a month together seeing whether it could be done. Nobody had done any wave prediction at the time. And you must remember that, because every surfer today on Friday goes down to his internet, and they will say, well, a good south swell coming in at Black's Beach, and you know, it's a part of the routine of living here in La Jolla, but it had never been done. And so we figured out, could it be done? And there were sort of 3 steps to it. We call them sea, swell, surf. Sea would be to do the prediction of how high were the waves coming out of the storm itself, depending on the wind speed and the fetch, the distance over which the wind blows. And then swell is what happens to the waves when they go sometimes thousands of kilometers from the storm to the beach. And then surf, probably the most difficult part of the prediction, what happens to the waves when they come into a given beach, are affected by the bottom bathymetry, etc. And we worked on that for a month, and then Harold Sweater agreed that it could be done, and we managed to persuade them to let us do that. And we did have 2 good days coming in on the landings in Northwest Africa. We did the prediction. On hindsight, it was 80% luck and 20% skill. I really, and I'll come back to that a little bit. But I remember having the agonizing time saying, here we have worked out a method to do that. Is it going to work? We ought to practice on it. And we looked at where in the world are we going to get some wave information so we could try and practice. And it turned out that Pan American Airways were landing their seaplanes in the Azores and had kept track of wave dimensions as part of the landing thing. And we got a hold of those records, and then we went back to historical weather maps and did what you call hindcasting. Used those maps to predict and compared it to the observations. And it looked pretty good, except once in a while there were huge waves reported, which we didn't predict. And I remember looking at those records, and they happened curiously at sort of evenly spaced intervals, which was curious. And we looked more on it. It turned out they were all invariably on Saturday nights. And we decided that they were more the result of Portuguese wine than wave conditions. I have to watch my time. You want me to, what time do you want me to quit? Yeah, I'm going to. Anyway, the next picture showed us, when we started a school for wave prediction at La Jolla, at Scripps, went back, and we would have 20 Navy and Army Air Corps weather officers who would come for a month, and we would teach wave forecasting. And we'd learned so much that each class had very, very little resemblance to the previous class. You know, that's the way it works on a new subject. When I previously said that it was incredibly lucky that we hit the Northwest African landing, well, it's because we learned so much more during that time. And we had about a year, 2 years of classes, and the officers who came out of our class did the prediction for the Pacific Theater of War, successfully as a whole. There have been no major failings in amphibious landings during the war. There was a major failing that you may know about at Tarawa, where the Marine Corps got into a terrible trouble, but it was not the waves, it was improper beach intelligence. The landing craft, there was a berm before you came to the beach. The landing craft ran ashore some 1,000 feet from the beach, and then everybody jumped over and started to storm in against enemy fire, and the water got deeper again. And the poor guys had 100 pounds of weight on there, and it was a terrible situation. And that had never happened again. There really was a quite simple way of avoiding that, on which we worked, and it's a very simple idea. The waves that come into a shore travel at a speed that depends on the depth, according to square root of GH. And by photographing from the air, say at 1 second intervals, you could see the speed of the waves coming in, and you can pick up the bathymetry, and it's been done extremely well these days, and there is. But there's an incredible amount of luck that we got things to work. Well, I think what I would like to do, I would say that my relations with the Navy have been, ever since that time, I've worked on many problems with them. And I got, 28 years ago, I got a chair that I Navy chair at Scripps, which I use now, and I'm still working. And maybe I would show the last slide. And here I had some pictures of our bomb tests. We went to Bikini and...
Show this one.
Shall I show the...
Tell the story about Bikini and then you can go back.
And then I can quit with that. Yeah, in 1946, Scripps took an active part in the test at Bikini, and the first bomb test. There were two tests, Abel and Baker. Are any of you here who played any role in that time of the war?
My father was there. He was in the Navy. I think he had a squadron of destroyers or a division.
I see.
Yeah.
Bikini was a great
Lots of
adventure.
pictures.
Uh-huh. And I don't have a Bikini picture, but I have to tell you about the best oceanographic measurements I've ever heard about. It was our job, among other things, to figure out how high the waves would be from the atomic explosion in Bikini Lagoon. Bikini Lagoon is 180 feet deep. There were two tests, Abel and Baker. Abel was an air drop, which they missed. And Baker was the seafloor, 180 feet, which worked. And a friend of mine, Jeff Holter, used to live here in La Jolla, came up with the following idea of how to measure the height of the waves generated by the Bikini explosion. We bought 2 cases of beer, emptied them, opened them, emptied them, and then nailed the open beer cans on the palm trees at various elevations, and then came back after the test and found out which ones were filled with water, which ones were empty. And it worked. It's about as good as any oceanographic test I know about. And 5 years later, in 51, we went to Eniwetok and participated in Ivy Mike, the H-bomb explosion, 1,000 times the size of Bikini, which was not small. And I show a picture here. It's an interesting story, and I will end with it. But Roger Revelle, a man named John Isaacs at Scripps, and I had become worried when we learned about the test at Eniwetok. We had been there and made measurements with a fathometer and found that the bottom of that very steep volcano were indications that there had been underwater landslides. You could see that there was an apron of sediments that had slid down. That is an area of no earthquakes, an aseismic area, and the H-bomb is the equivalent of a 7.1 earthquake. We said, well, now, why wouldn't you think that would generate an underwater landslide? It's the biggest shock that this thing had gotten forever. And underwater landslides are good generators of tsunamis. And so we insisted and succeeded in that the format of the test was to be changed and that people were appointed to go to all the nearby islands and make preparations in case a tsunami would be generated by the test. And the way there's no way to tell ahead of time where they would happen. So we set up 2 moorings on seamounts, small little platforms, 4 by 4 feet, and you see one of them in the foreground, moored to a seamount, and then a pressure sensor attached to the cable so that if a wave would be generated, you would pick up the pressure as it appeared at that area. And then we were on the ship called the Horizon, and they had an open circuit to the commander of our test, and they had an open circuit to the nearby 12 islands, and they had made arrangements to evacuate lower areas. They would have something like 15-minute time that it would take for the tsunami to come from the test site. As it happened, there was no tsunami. I'm still amazed. And so it wouldn't have been necessary. But we got rained upon. The ship became radioactive and had not been useful for some work ever since.
You should explain that you were one of the people on one of those.
I was one of the 2 people on the platform. And I'm probably one of the few people now who are alive who saw an H-bomb exploded. Horrible sight, and I was the closest person to it, and I've never forgotten it. It's a frightening sight. I hope you never experience that. And I would tell that story, and I would end up by saying, I got rained upon after a H-bomb test, but I haven't been affected. Thank you. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
How close were you to the H-bomb?
About 7 kilometers, I think. Close, too close. The funny thing is, it appeared not at a distance, but the mushroom cloud came up and came over you, and you felt that you were sort of covered by it. Frightening sight.
Walter, is there any underground evidence to show that we might have a tsunami off the shores of La Jolla?
Well, as you know, it's not a very active region, but there are some faults. There is the fault that goes out to sea at the beach club. The what's it called? The Rose Canyon fault, and it could happen. And it's a frightening thought. I don't think we're in good position to be defended.
And then, could you tell us something about your experiments to determine whether the temperature of the ocean is changing by sending sound waves up towards Alaska?
We're doing that now, and the ocean has warmed. It's warmed about a little more than 0.15 degrees, not very much, but definitely has warmed in the last. It has warmed about a fraction of a degree globally. It's hard to get a global average, but almost every place it has warmed. The upper few hundred meters are up about a half a degree. The lower depths have not been as much affected. But if it were not for the storage of heat in the ocean, the atmosphere would warm at 3 times the rate, because the ocean has accommodated most of the additional heating from global warming. And Scripps is very much involved in that problem, as you probably know. And if you're going to ask me whether there has been warming, the answer is yes. And has the sea level gone up? Yes. Sea level is now going up at the rate of 1 foot a century, global sea level.
Now, what happens to the carbon dioxide? Does that go into carbonic acid or what?
It mostly goes into the atmosphere and changes the temperature of the planet Earth.
But doesn't it also go into the water?
It does.
CO2?
It has a time constant of about 1,000 years. So it takes a very long time to get the additional CO2 out of the atmosphere back into the ocean and then to be deposited, as you say. It's a very difficult problem. Yeah.
Of all of your work at Scripps, what are you most proud of? Your scientific work?
I guess.
Particular paper that.
Well, I think my most fun, when I left and then became a faculty member, I wanted to get away from waves because I didn't want to be a person who just worked on waves all their lives. And I couldn't, because no matter where we went, there was some new evidence. And I was, to my surprise, about 2 years ago, I got a call saying, "Congratulations, you have been made honorary member of the Groundswell Society." Are there any members of the Groundswell Society in my audience here? It's a society of professional people who are all surfers and want to have fun and not be involved in political things. A wonderful group of about 200 people. They meet once a year at Scripps, and they are very serious about it. And I got invited for learning where the summer swell comes from. And you know, the summer swell comes from the southern hemisphere, where during July and August they have winter, and some of the swell reaching La Jolla was generated half the circumference of the Earth away, 10,000 kilometers, or more than that, 15,000 kilometers away in the Indian Ocean, and comes by Australia and New Zealand into the South Pacific, comes up the North Pacific, takes it a week to get here from the storm. And I guess I can take credit for having discovered that the southern swell comes from long distance. And I got elected because I was the one who found where the swell begins. Those are the words. I'm very proud of that.
Any more? One more.
Yeah, Walter, it was interesting hearing your connection with the Norwegian and how that cost you your clearance.
With Haraldsberg, yeah.
Because wasn't that last year that you received a major honor from an organization in Norway and a large amount of funding that supported your work there?
Yeah. Well,
Could you tell us about that?
yeah, the clearance problem, because has gone away. Haraldsberg was not involved in any activity. As you could see, I saw the whole file, and I remember reading about my landlady in Washington, D.C. being asked whether I was a loyal American. She said, yes, he probably is, but I would not rent him a room again because he's so sloppy. But anyhow, I did get a major medal from the King of Sweden.
Oh, Sweden, not Norway?
It's the Crafoord Prize, and it's given by the King of Sweden. But we are on the best of terms. Barry and I were in Norway not so long ago, in Bergen, where now the most active Norwegian research comes from, and the Norwegians are doing a wonderful job, and we were working with them on some tests concerning the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which is the key to the prediction of sea level problem. The key is how quickly the Greenland ice sheet is going to melt, and we are working with the Norwegians on trying to learn what the melting processes in fact are. Yes.
Why is Greenland called Greenland when it's covered so
You know, when Greenland was discovered, it was a much warmer period.
What year would that
I think we're talking about something like the 13th or 14th century, when the Norwegian...
10th century.
Was it 10th century, even earlier? And at that time, Greenland, it was warmer, and they could actually raise wine, I believe, in Greenland at the time. And I think they called it the Greenland at the time. Nice. Have you been there? Lovely,
No.
lovely area.
Fabulous.
Thank you.